The worst thing about grief, June had learned, was how quietly it let you believe you were fine. She had convinced herself completely. 4 years of practicing the lie until it fit like a second skin, worn smooth at the edges, comfortable in its deception. She smiled when neighbors asked. She managed the cottage accounts in neat columns. She braided her hair every morning with steady hands and told herself that steadiness was the same as strength. She and Kian were fine. She repeated it the way some women repeated prayers. The morning market in Veldmore smelled the way it always did in deep autumn, wood smoke curling from the baker's chimney, cold mud beneath the cartwheels, cinnamon bark laid out on burlap squares, dried lavender bundled near the spice merchant's stall in tight purple fists. June moved through the narrow lane with her wicker basket hooked over one arm, and Kian's small hand locked firmly in her other, his fingers warm and restless against her palm. He was 7. He had his father's dark hair and her own gray eyes, and she sometimes found that combination quietly disorienting, like looking at a portrait painted by 2 different artists who had never met. She loved him with the specific ferocity of someone who has learned that love is not a guarantee of anything. It did not protect. It did not preserve. But it was still the only thing she had that felt entirely true. "You're walking too slow," Kian announced. "I'm walking at a perfectly reasonable pace. The bread lady runs out of the seated ones. The bread lady has never run out in 4 years of market mornings." He made a sound of elaborate skepticism, a new development, this talent for expressing doubt through breath alone, and leaned his weight forward, pulling her along. She let him. The cold air stung her nose and tightened the skin over her knuckles where she gripped the basket. Frost had arrived early to the valley this year. She felt it in her bones before she felt it in the air, which was something her mother had always done too, reading weather through the body like a language. She had not slept well. That was not unusual, but last night had been a particular kind of restless. Her dreams full of sounds she could not place when she woke. Something heavy moving through forest undergrowth, a breathing that was too large and too deliberate to be human, the specific weight of silence that follows something apex and patient. She had woken before the first bell, with her heart striking hard against her ribs, and lain in the dark of the cottage listening to nothing, until Cian's small feet padded down the hallway, and he climbed into her bed without asking, the way he still sometimes did, tucking himself against her side with the absolute confidence of someone who has never once doubted his welcome. She had held him and stared at the ceiling, and told herself it was only a dream. It was only ever a dream. They reached Marin's bread stall, with the seeded loaves still stacked 3 rows deep, which June pointed out with quiet satisfaction, and Cian accepted, without conceding. He chose his loaf with the gravity of a council decision, turning it over in both hands, examining the crust. June paid with the small coins she kept folded inside her cloak pocket, exchanged a nod with Marin, a stout woman with flour always in her eyebrows, and tucked the loaf into the basket beneath the wrapped parcel of hard cheese. The market was fuller than usual for a cold morning. She noticed it gradually. More cloaks than faces, more horses tethered at the far post than she'd seen since the harvest festival. An unusual number of men, who stood in pairs at the edge of the lane, and watched the crowd with the particular stillness of people who were paid to notice things. They wore no uniform she recognized, but they carried themselves with a military economy of movement. Weight balanced, eyes moving, shoulders set. She pulled Kian a little closer. "Don't pull," he said. "I'm not pulling." Your hand got tighter. She loosened her grip deliberately and pretended to examine the root vegetables at the next stall. Turnips. She didn't need turnips. She picked one up anyway and turned it over, using the motion to scan the lane without appearing to. The men were not watching her. They were watching everything. That general, sweeping attention that suggests a principal nearby. Someone important enough to require a perimeter of quiet vigilance. She had grown up in a household that understood rank and its requirements. Her father had been steward to the regional lord before he died, and she had learned early that certain kinds of stillness in men meant power was present somewhere close. She set the turnip down and moved on. They were nearly at the candle merchant's stall when Kian stopped. Not the gradual stop of a child distracted by something bright. A full, sudden stop, his hand going rigid in hers, his small body orienting the way a compass needle orients, with complete and immediate certainty. "Mama." His voice had changed register. She looked down at him first, then followed his gaze. At the far end of the market lane, where the stalls thinned and the road widened toward the stone bridge, a man stood still among the movement of the crowd. He was. Her mind searched for the right word and kept arriving at vast. Not only in height, though he was tall enough that the men nearest him seemed to diminish simply by proximity. It was something more fundamental than size. He wore dark leather armor, crossed with broad straps at the chest, a mane of black fur at the shoulders of his cloak that caught the cold wind and didn't move the way ordinary fabric moved. His hair was long and braided back from his face, dark as the fur, and his jaw was set with the kind of stillness that suggested he had not needed to prove himself through expression for a very long time. He was not browsing. He was not speaking to anyone. He was looking directly at her. June felt the attention like a pressure change. Something shifting in the air between them, subtle and complete, the way the atmosphere thins before a storm. His eyes were pale from this distance, pale and absolutely fixed. She looked away first. Her heart, for no reason she could articulate, was beating the way it had when she'd woken from the dream. "Why is he staring at you?" Kian demanded. His voice had taken on the particular flatness that preceded what she privately called his declarations. The moments when her 7-year-old son decided that something required correction and appointed himself the instrument of that correction. "He isn't staring," she said quietly. "Come, we need the—" "He is." Kian had turned fully toward the man now, chin lifted, gray eyes direct and entirely unimpressed by the disparity in their sizes. "He's been staring since we passed the cheese stall." "Tian?" But he had already taken one step forward, planting himself with his small boots in the mud, and when he spoke his voice carried the way only a child's absolute certainty can carry, clean and loud, and without any awareness of its own audacity. "Stop staring at my mom." The words fell into one of those odd pockets of market quiet. A cart pausing, a merchant turning, the wind briefly holding, so that they landed with considerably more weight than a 7-year-old's warning had any right to carry. June's face went hot. Several people nearby turned. The bread lady looked up. One of the still watchful men at the lane's edge had gone completely motionless in a different way now, the way a person goes motionless when something unexpected has happened and they are waiting to understand it. And the man at the end of the lane, the vast, leather-clad, fur-shouldered man with the pale eyes, looked down at Cian. Something moved across his face. Not offense. Not amusement, exactly. Something quieter than either. He regarded the boy for a long moment with an expression June could not read from this distance, and then, slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone unaccustomed to the gesture, he inclined his head. A nod, brief and complete, as though Kian had said something entirely reasonable and he was acknowledging it as such. Then his gaze lifted back to June. And it was worse, somehow, than before. Not threatening, not aggressive, simply certain. Like he was looking at something he had already decided about. She took Cian's shoulder, turned him firmly toward the candle stall, and walked. "I wasn't done," Cian said. "You were absolutely done." He was still Cian. She said his name in the register that ended conversations, and he subsided, though she could feel the dissatisfaction radiating from him like heat. Her own pulse had not yet steadied. She focused on the smell of beeswax and tallow ahead of them, on the cold weight of the basket, on the ordinary, reliable reality of market morning. She did not look back. She told herself she did not need to. But she could feel, with a clarity she had no explanation for, that he was still watching. That he had not moved. That the space between them, though she was walking away from it, was not actually getting larger. She held Tian's hand and kept walking, and told herself that too was only a feeling. She was wrong about that, as it turned out. She was wrong about quite a few things that morning. She told herself the man at the market was nothing, a a traveler, a merchant's guard, someone passing through Veldmoor on the way to somewhere more important, which described most people who came through the valley at all. The town sat at the edge of the Greywood, close enough to shifter territory that unusual men were not unusual exactly. She had learned not to look too carefully at strangers in Veldmoor. Looking too carefully at the wrong kind of stranger had a way of becoming its own problem. She told herself this the whole walk home. She told herself this while she unpacked the basket on the kitchen table and sliced the seeded bread and poured Kian a cup of warmed cider from the pot she'd left hanging over the low fire. She told herself this while he sat on the bench and ate with the focused efficiency of a child who had recently discovered that food was fuel for arguments. And while she stood at the window and looked out at the lane and saw nothing but frost-stiffened grass and the neighbor's gray cat picking its way along the fence. Normal. Entirely normal. She turned from the window and sat across from her son. "You can't do that," she said. He looked up, a crumb on his chin. "Do what?" "Speak to strangers that way." He was staring. "People look at people, Cian. That's what eyes are for." "Not like that." He picked up his cup with both hands, the way he still sometimes did despite her gentle corrections, and regarded her over the rim with an expression that was uncomfortably perceptive for a 7-year-old. "He was looking at you like he knew you." June said nothing for a moment. "He doesn't know me," she said. "How do you know?" "Because I would know if someone knew me." Kian considered this with visible skepticism, and then apparently decided to let it rest, which was a mercy, because she did not have a better answer than that. She reached across the table and brushed the crumb from his chin with her thumb, and he tolerated it with the barely concealed impatience of a boy who had recently decided he was almost grown. She loved him so much, it was sometimes difficult to breathe. The letter arrived that afternoon, not from the market, not from the pale-eyed stranger. From somewhere she had stopped expecting, the wax seal on the folded parchment bearing the crest she still recognized despite 4 years of deliberate forgetting. A tower divided by a river, pressed in dark red wax. The seal of House Vielle, her husband's family, her late husband's family. She stood in the doorway holding it for a long moment while Kian was in the back room arranging his carved wooden animals into formations that he explained were military strategy, his voice a low, ongoing commentary she could hear through the wall. She turned the letter over. The seal was unbroken. Her name was written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize. Not her mother-in-law's cramped script, not the steward's careful block letters. Someone knew. She broke it open at the kitchen table. It was short. 3 paragraphs, formal in the way legal language is formal. Precise, airless, designed to communicate something significant, while revealing as little warmth as possible. She read it once quickly, her eyes moving ahead of her comprehension. Then she read it again slowly, and this time understanding arrived like cold water. Rowan's estate, the modest holdings in the Eastern Valley that had technically passed to her at his death, pending the family's formal acknowledgement, which she had been waiting 4 years to receive and had mostly stopped waiting for, was being contested. Not by a distant relation, not by a legal technicality, by Rowan's brother, Davin, who had apparently, according to the letter's careful language, recently uncovered documentation suggesting the original marriage compact was improperly registered, which was a very elegant way of saying that Davin Vielle intended to argue that her marriage had been invalid and that therefore she held no claim to anything bearing the Vale name, including, the letter's final paragraph noted with the particular cruelty of legal precision, the financial provision that had been set aside for the maintenance of any children of the Union. June set the letter down on the table. She looked at her hands. They were not shaking. She noticed this with a kind of distant surprise. She had expected them to shake. They were very still. She thought about Rowan. About the man she had married at 22, whom she had loved with the uncomplicated faith of someone who had not yet learned that love required vetting. He had been kind to her. She believed that still. He had not, she thought, known what his family was. Or perhaps he had known, and had been too gentle to fight it, and had died before he was forced to choose a side, She had forgiven him for that. She was less certain she could forgive his brother. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to Tian breathe in the next room, that slow, absolute rhythm of a child who has not yet learned to lie awake worrying, and stared at the ceiling and made calculations. The provision was not a fortune. It was enough. Enough for the cottage lease, enough for the market, enough for a good pair of boots for Tian when he outgrew his current ones, and he was already outgrowing them. Without it, she had her own modest savings, and the skill with a needle that had gotten her through the first winter after Rowan's death, taking in mending from the merchant families. She could survive it. She had survived worse. But the claim about the marriage compact, that was something else. That was Davin reaching not just into her purse but into her past, trying to unmake what had been real. Trying to make Cian's parentage a question instead of a certainty, that she would not forgive. She must have slept eventually, because the dream came again. Deeper this time. The forest was the greywood. She knew it somehow even in the dream, knew the particular thickness of those trees, the way the pines grew so close, the canopy sealed out the sky. She was moving through it without knowing why, her feet bare against the root-tangled ground. The cold irrelevant the way cold is irrelevant in dreams, and something was moving alongside her, just at the edge of visibility, large and dark and deliberate, keeping pace, not chasing, keeping pace, like an escort, like a guard. She turned to look, and the dream dissolved, and she was awake again with her heart loud, and the letter on the kitchen table, and the frost pressing white fingers against the window glass. She went to the Veldmore Records office when it opened at the first bell of morning. Tian left with old Marta next door, who kept hard candies and an ancient, tolerant hound that Kian called General. The records clerk, a thin young man who looked perpetually aggrieved by the existence of the public, informed her that yes, a formal contest had been filed, that yes, it was legitimate in its submission, that the hearing would be held in 3 weeks' time at the circuit magistrate's session in the hall. And the documentation they submitted? She asked. The claim about the registration? He consulted his ledger with theatrical slowness. The contesting party has submitted what is described as an amended compact, signed prior to the marriage ceremony, indicating a conditional clause that was not disclosed to the registrar at time of filing. That document is a forgery, June said. She said it very calmly, the way she had said everything this morning, and the clerk looked up at her for the first time. That may be, he said, with the tone of someone who found the truth thoroughly beside the point. You would need to demonstrate that to the magistrate. How would I demonstrate it? The original compact, if you have it, a witness to the ceremony with knowledge of the full agreement. Or, he paused, representation from someone with sufficient standing to challenge the submitted document formally. Meaning a lawyer. Meaning someone the magistrate is obliged to take seriously. He said it not unkindly, which made it worse. She thanked him and left. Outside, the morning was white and still, the frost undisturbed on the cobblestones, her breath making small clouds. She stood on the step of the records office and looked at the empty street and understood with quiet, complete clarity that Davin Vielle had timed this deliberately. 3 weeks before a winter circuit session, a forged document she had no resources to formally challenge. A claim designed not to succeed necessarily, but to exhaust her, to cost her money she didn't have. Time, credibility, the energy of someone already managing everything alone. He wanted her to simply stop, to go away, to take Kian and disappear into the kind of obscurity that required no further effort to maintain. She stood very still for a moment. Then she straightened the front of her cloak, adjusted the clasp at her throat, and stepped down onto the cobblestones. She would not go away. She had nowhere to go, which was, she supposed, one form of courage. She was crossing the stone bridge back toward the cottage lane when she heard the horses. Not market horses, not the plodding patience of cart animals. These moved with intention, hooves ringing on the stone with the particular cadence of animals well-bred and well-ridden, and there were several of them. She stepped to the side of the bridge automatically, her back to the low stone railing to let them pass. 4 riders. The same quality of stillness in the outriders she had noticed yesterday at the market. Watchful, balanced, professional. And at the center, on a black horse that seemed almost too composed for its own size. Him. The man from the market. He was not looking at the road ahead. He was looking at her. She held her ground. She was cold and tired, and had just been told by a government clerk that her son's future required someone important to take it seriously, and she had very little patience left for being unsettled by a stranger's gaze, however unusual it was. His horse slowed. The outriders adjusted without instruction. The whole procession came to a stop in the middle of the bridge, which struck her as both arrogant and entirely expected. He looked at her from the height of the saddle with those pale, certain eyes, and said nothing for a moment. Just looked. With that same quality she had felt yesterday, not aggression, not performance, but something that felt disturbingly like recognition. Then quietly, in a voice that was lower than she'd expected and carried without effort in the cold morning air. "You went to the records office." It was not a question. June met his gaze and kept her voice even. "That is none of your concern." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, close enough to be dangerous. "I'm beginning to think," he said, "that it might be." She should have walked away. She knew it with the same clarity with which she knew the frost would thicken tonight, that Kian needed new boot soles before the first true snow, that Davin Vale's forged document was going to cost her something she couldn't yet calculate. These were facts. Solid, cold, useful. The kind of knowledge that kept a woman moving in the right direction when everything around her was designed to confuse. Walking away from a stranger on a bridge who knew where she had spent her morning, that was clearly the right direction. She didn't walk away. "You've been following me," she said. "No." He said it without defensiveness, which was its own kind of answer. "I've been in Veldmore for 2 days. It's a small town. Small enough that you happened to be at the market when I was at the market, and on this bridge when I crossed it." "Small enough," he agreed, with a patience that suggested he did not feel the need to explain himself, and was choosing to anyway, which she noted despite herself. She looked at him, properly, the way she hadn't allowed herself to do at the market, when looking had felt like something with consequences. He was younger than the fur-shouldered authority of his posture had initially suggested. Perhaps 30, perhaps a few years beyond. The leather armor was not ceremonial. It was worn at the edges, marked with use. The braids in his dark hair were practical rather than decorative, pinned back from a face that was all clean angles, and something guarded behind the pale eyes, something that had learned to stay behind the surface. His horse stood absolutely still beneath him. The outriders had not moved. "What do you want?" she asked. He considered the question as though it deserved actual consideration. "To speak with you, without your son issuing warnings at me." Despite everything, the letter, the sleepless night, the records clerk's quietly devastating assessment of her options, something pulled briefly at the corner of her mouth. She suppressed it. "He was protecting me," she said. "I know." Again that quality of simple acknowledgement, no amusement at Cian's expense. "He has good instincts." That landed differently than she'd expected. She looked at him a moment longer, recalibrating, and then said, "I don't speak with strangers who know my business and haven't explained how." "Fair." He dismounted in a single motion, the horse unmoved, the outriders still, and stood on the bridge at a distance that was respectful and deliberate, not closing the gap, but no longer speaking down from the height of the saddle. She noted the courtesy of it, even as she resented what it suggested, that he was accustomed to managing how threatening he appeared, and had made a calculation about her. He was half a head taller than she'd estimated. She was not a small woman, and she felt small, which she disliked intensely. "My name is Evander," he said. He said only that. No family name, no title, No elaboration. She waited for more, and none came, which told her something. Men who needed titles announced them. Men who were secure in what they were did not. "June," she said, because refusing seemed theatrical at this point. "I know." At her expression, he added, "The market. Maren called you by name when you paid." That was plausible. It was probably true. She filed it without fully accepting it. "You said my business at the records office might concern you," she said. "Explain that." He looked at her for a moment. That steady, undecorated attention that she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things. Not performance, not intimidation. Just looking. "Davenville filed that contest 6 weeks ago," he said. "Not 3. The records office here received the forwarded notice 3 weeks ago. The original filing was made in the capital, through a magistrate with connections to a trading consortium that has been acquiring disputed properties in this valley for the last 2 years. June went very still. "How do you know that?" she said quietly. "Because 3 of those properties border Greywood territory," he said. "And what happens on the borders of Greywood territory is my concern." The cold on the bridge was different now. Not just weather, but something that had settled into the conversation and wasn't leaving. She looked at him and understood that the thing she had been trying not to know since yesterday was insisting on being known. He was not a merchant's guard. He was not a traveler. The stillness of his men, the way the town had felt different yesterday, fuller, more alert, the quality of his horse and his leather, and the absolute absence of uncertainty in anything he said or did. "What are you?" she asked, though she was fairly certain she already knew. "Alpha," he said, simply, without theater. "Of which pack?" A pause, just brief enough to be meaningful. "All of them," he said. She did not invite him to the cottage. She was clear about that, in her own mind. Even as she found herself standing in the front room 20 minutes later, watching him duck slightly to clear the doorframe and straighten to his full height inside her small kitchen, which immediately felt like a different room, compressed and rearranged around his presence. She had left the outriders outside. She had told him he had 10 minutes. She had told herself she was doing this because the information he had about the Vale filing was potentially useful, and she was a practical woman, not because her legs had been unsteady on the bridge, and she had needed to sit down and the cottage was closer than any other option. She put the kettle on because it gave her something to do with her hands. He sat at the kitchen table without being invited to, which should have annoyed her and landed somewhere different, like watching someone who knew how to take up space without performing the taking. He looked at the letter still sitting on the table. "May I?" he asked. She considered. Nodded. He read it in the same way he seemed to do everything, without hurry, without visible reaction, the pale eyes moving steadily down the page. He set it back down exactly as it had been. "The amended compact they claim to have," he said, "doesn't exist." "I know that. The magistrate in the capital who accepted the filing has done this before. There is a pattern. He accepts a contested document, schedules the hearing at circuit. The original claimant lacks the resources or representation to mount a formal challenge, and the property transfers." He paused. "He has done it 11 times in 4 years. 11. The word tasted like rust. "Your case is the first involving a child's provision." The kettle had begun to whisper. She turned and poured water over the dried herbs in the 2 cups she had set out. Chamomile, because it was what she had. And the steam rose white and fragrant, and she stood with her back to him for a moment, breathing it in, letting the warmth settle her hands. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked without turning around. "Because you deserve to know." "That isn't an answer. That's a reason why you feel good about telling me. I'm asking why you're involved." A silence. Then, in a tone that was careful in a way his voice hadn't been before. "Because the consortium acquiring these properties is not simply a trading group. It is partly financed by 3 pack lords who have been pushing the boundary of my territory for 2 years. They use human legal mechanisms to acquire land, then transfer management to pack-controlled interests. It gives them territorial expansion that doesn't look like territorial expansion. She turned around. And Rowan's estate, she said slowly. The holdings in the Eastern Valley. Sit directly on the access corridor to the Greywood's northern edge, he confirmed. She set the cups on the table and sat down across from him, and looked at the letter, and then at him. So my son's inheritance, she said, keeping her voice very even, is being stolen as part of a territorial conspiracy. Yes. And you're here because stopping that conspiracy is in your interest. He met her eyes. Yes. She appreciated that, the honesty of it. She had expected something softer, some reassurance, some generous framing. He had simply said yes because it was true, and he did not seem to think she required softening. "And what do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I want to offer you something. Access to my legal counsel. They can challenge the forged compact formally, which will hold weight because of who I am. Evidence about the magistrate's pattern, submitted through channels that will force an investigation rather than a hearing. And testimony, if necessary, from my own records about the original Vile marriage filing." He paused. "You don't need to give me anything in return. This serves my interests regardless of your involvement." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back, patient. Still. "You're the Lycan King," she said. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise. Closer to the careful stillness of someone who had been waiting to see when she would say it. "Yes," he said. "Tian doesn't know that." "I'm aware. He told you to stop staring at his mother." The thing at her mouth pulled again, and this time she was tired enough not to fully suppress it. He told the Lycan King to stop staring at his mother. And Evander, the alpha of all alphas, ruler of every shifter territory from the Greywood to the Eastern Range, looked at her across her small kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea in his large hands and said, with absolute sincerity, "He was right." June looked at him. And for the first time in 4 years, she didn't know what to do with a feeling that wasn't grief. She didn't trust it. But she felt it. And that, in itself, was something she had not expected to happen again. She did not sleep well again that night, but for different reasons. The dreams were quieter. No forest, no breathing alongside her in the dark. Just the ordinary restlessness of a mind that had been handed too many things at once and was refusing to set any of them down. She lay in the narrow bed and went over the conversation on the bridge, and then in the kitchen, turning each piece of it over the way Kian turned bread loaves at the market, checking for flaws, for soft spots, for the thing that was wrong underneath the crust. She found several. He had information about the Vial filing that should not have been easily accessible. He had been in Veldmore 2 days, which meant he had arrived before she received the letter, which meant he had known about the contest before she did. He had offered her something that cost him nothing, or nothing obvious, and had been careful to frame it as mutual interest, which was either admirable honesty or very sophisticated manipulation, and she had learned the hard way that those two things were not always distinguishable from the outside. Rowan had been kind too. Right up until the end, Rowan had been kind. She turned over and listened to the wind move through the eaves, and told herself that noticing a man's eyes was not the same as trusting him, that accepting legal assistance was not the same as accepting anything else, that she was 26 years old, a widow, a mother, a woman with 3 weeks before a hearing that could unmake the last stable thing she had, and she could not afford the particular luxury of being wrong about someone again. She would use what he was offering, carefully, with both hands on the door at all times. That was the plan. In the morning, Kian found out. Not from her. From the butcher's boy, who had heard from his father, who had heard from one of the stable hands at the inn where Evander's party was lodged, that the riders who had come into Veldmore 2 days past were the king's guard, the personal escort of the Lycan King himself. Kian came home from returning Marta's borrowed pot with his eyes very wide, and his voice at a pitch she recognized as controlled excitement working hard against itself. "Mama," he said, setting the pot on the table with exaggerated care. Did you know? Know what? That man. Which man? He gave her a look of profound patience. The man I told to stop staring at you. She kept her expression neutral and turned back to the bread she was slicing. What about him? He's the king. I'm aware. A long silence. She could feel him recalibrating behind her. The specific quality of his quiet when he was rearranging information into a new shape. You knew, he said finally. You knew and you didn't tell me. I found out yesterday afternoon. Did he come here? She paused for 1/2 second. Briefly, the silence this time was different. Heavier. She turned around and found him sitting on the bench with his arms crossed and an expression that was trying very hard to be merely thoughtful and was not entirely succeeding. I told the king to stop staring, he said. You did. At my mother. Yes. He absorbed this. Was he angry? No. Did he say anything? She considered how to answer that. He nodded, she said. He thought you were right. Kian uncrossed his arms. The expression shifted into something she couldn't immediately categorize. Still processing. But the balance had changed. He was 7. But he had his father's quality of stillness when something genuinely surprised him, and it always made him look briefly older. Oh, he said. He seems... Kian searched for the word. Big. He is big. Is he a good king? June set down the bread knife, looked at her son, felt the question land in the complicated place it was clearly aimed at, even if he couldn't have articulated the aim. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Tian nodded, as though that were a satisfactory answer, and reached for his bread. Evander sent his legal counsel that same afternoon, a woman named Sable, compact and sharp-eyed, with ink-stained fingers and a satchel of documents that she laid out on June's kitchen table, with the brisk confidence of someone who had argued before kings and found magistrates considerably less interesting. She was not warm exactly, but she was precise, and she listened to June's account of the filing without interrupting, and asked 3 questions at the end that went straight to the exact points June had been worrying at herself. The forged compact, Sable said, tapping the edge of one document. Do you have the original? In the cottage, in the locked box under the bed. She had checked it that morning. First thing, still there, the seal intact, Rowan's signature beside hers in the careful hand of a man who had taken the ceremony seriously. Good. We'll need a certified copy submitted to the Capitol Registry before the circuit session. I'll prepare the formal challenge to the magistrate's acceptance of the amended document. That goes through the king's office, which means it cannot be quietly rerouted. Sable paused, glancing up. The magistrate has done this 11 times. I know. He won't do it a 12th. This challenge will trigger a review of all 11 prior cases. She said it without drama, the way people state facts they have already decided. The families who lost property. Do you know any of them? 2, June said slowly. The Farron family. And old Weiss, who died last winter. His daughter is still in the valley. Sable made a note. I'll want to speak with them. Corroborating pattern strengthens the challenge from persuasive to definitive. June watched her write and felt something she hadn't felt in the records office yesterday, or lying awake last night, or in any of the cold calculations of the past 24 hours. She felt like something could actually be done. It was a fragile feeling. She held it carefully. Evander came himself at dusk. She had not expected that. Sable had come and gone, and June had been sitting by the fire going through her own copy of the marriage compact line by line. Kian asleep early after a day of what he called very important thinking, and the knock at the door was quiet and unhurried, and when she opened it, he was standing alone on the step. No outriders, no ceremony. Just him in the cold evening, his breath making slow clouds, a small wrapped parcel in one hand. From the candle merchant, he said, when she looked at the parcel. Kian mentioned the beeswax ones when I passed the stall. She stared at him. You bought my son candles. He mentioned them specifically. When he was at Marta's this morning, I was passing. He paused. I was not following anyone. She took the parcel. It was warm from being held. You were passing Marta's house. It's a small town, he said, with the same patience as before. She should have been irritated. She examined the feeling and found it was not quite irritation. She stepped back from the door. You can come in, she said. Briefly. He came in briefly. He sat at the table again, and she did not make tea this time, and the fire was lower, and the room was quieter without the afternoon light. She sat across from him and put the candles on the table between them. Why are you here? She said. Not why did Sable come? Why are you here? He looked at the fire for a moment before answering. Something in the set of his jaw was different in the firelight. Less controlled, she thought. Or the same control with less surface covering it. Because I wanted to know if you were all right, he said. I'm fine. You haven't been sleeping. She went very still. You can't know that. The way you move, he said simply. The margin at the edge of your eyes. The way you held the basket at the market yesterday, tighter than the weight required. He paused. I notice things. It isn't surveillance. I'm not able to stop doing it. She looked at him for a long moment. That's an unsettling quality in a king, she said. It's a useful quality in a king, he said. It is sometimes unsettling in everything else. The fire shifted, a log settling. The silence was not uncomfortable, which she noticed and immediately distrusted, because comfortable silences with men who were interested in you were precisely the kind of thing that had consequences. I need to ask you something, she said. Yes. The mate bond. She watched his face. It did not change, which was answer enough. You feel it. A pause. He looked at her directly. Yes. Since when? Since the market, when your son... The corner of his mouth moved. When your son corrected me. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She had promised herself she would be practical. Practical about all of it. I need you to understand something. I was bonded before. Or I thought I was. I married a man and I loved him, and he died, and his family is currently trying to unmake my son's legitimacy. I am not someone who can afford to feel a bond and follow it without thinking. I know, he said. I'm not refusing, she said carefully. I'm not accepting. I'm telling you that I need time and I need this. She gestured between them. I to stay separate from the help you're providing. I won't be able to trust the help if I think it's conditional. He looked at her with those pale eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then, the help is not conditional. It never was. The consortium damages my territory. That is true regardless of anything else. Sable will complete the challenge regardless of anything else. He held her gaze. I'm here in the evenings because I find it difficult not to be. That is my problem, not yours. June looked at him. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutter she'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. The fire was warm. The beeswax candles sat between them unwrapped, pale and clean-smelling, and Kian was asleep in the next room, and the letter from Devon Vale was still on the edge of the table like a bruise that hadn't finished forming. Fix the shutter before you go, she said. A pause. It's on the east side, she added. The pin has been loose since summer. He stood. He went outside, and she listened to the brief, efficient sounds of someone who knew how to use their hands, and in 4 minutes he came back in and the shutter was quiet. He paused at the door. Good night, June, he said. Good night, she said, without his name. Not yet. He left. She sat by the fire with the candles and the letter, and the feeling she didn't trust, and held all of it at once, carefully. The way you hold something that might be fragile or might be strong and you don't yet know which. The hearing was supposed to be in 3 weeks. It happened in 2. Sable came to the cottage on a Tuesday morning with frost still hard on the ground, and her satchel fuller than usual, and she sat down without being invited and spread 4 documents across the table with the focused efficiency of someone delivering news that needed to be received sitting down. "The magistrate moved the session forward," she said. "Filed the change yesterday evening through the circuit office. We believe Davin Vial was informed of the formal challenge and pressured for an earlier date, before our submission to the Capital Registry could be fully processed." June looked at the documents. "Can he do that?" "Technically, yes. A circuit magistrate has scheduling discretion." Sable's voice was precise and controlled, but there was something underneath it, a tightness. "However, the challenge submission went through the King's office yesterday morning, before the date change. That timing matters." "Why?" "Because a challenge through the King's office creates a mandatory review period before any hearing can proceed. The magistrate either doesn't know that yet, or he's gambling that we won't be able to invoke it in time." June pressed her fingers flat on the table. "And can we?" "Evander is already at the hall." She looked up. "He went this morning," Sable said, "when we were informed of the date change. He went personally." June said nothing for a moment. Outside, Kian was in Marta's garden helping rake leaves, his voice carrying faintly through the window, that running commentary he kept up regardless of audience, narrating his own actions with the confidence of someone who expected the world to find him interesting. Which, she had to admit, it generally did. "He didn't tell me," she said. "He went before dawn." Sable paused, and for the first time since June had met her, something slightly less than clinical crossed her face. "He didn't want you to feel that the resolution required you to be present for it. He wanted it handled before you had to walk into that hall." June sat with that for a moment. She was not sure how she felt about it. Part of her, the part that had been managing everything alone for 4 years, that had learned to be present for every difficult thing because no one else would be, felt the faint friction of being stepped around. And underneath that, something quieter and less guarded, the unfamiliar sensation of someone doing something hard on her behalf. Not because she had asked. Not because there was an obvious benefit. But simply because they could and she shouldn't have to. She had forgotten that was something that happened. That it was something that could be real. He returned at midday. She was at the cottage. She had not gone to the hall, though she had stood at the window for most of the morning looking at the lane with her cloak on. Cian had come back from Marta's and was sitting at the table with a piece of chalk and a flat board, drawing what he explained was a map of a territory that didn't exist yet, but would soon. She heard the horse on the lane before she saw him. She opened the door before he knocked. He was still in riding clothes, dark leather marked with the cold, his hair wind-loosened from its braids, and he looked at her from the step with an expression that was the least composed she had seen on him, and still more composed than most people managed at their steadiest. "It's done," he said. She gripped the doorframe. "Tell me." The magistrate's scheduling change was overruled on the basis of the mandatory review period. The challenge was formally accepted into the Capital record this morning. The original hearing date stands, but it's now a review hearing, not a contest hearing. The burden of proof has reversed. Davin Vial must now prove the amended compact is genuine, not you prove it's false. He paused. He can't prove it. It doesn't exist. June breathed. She breathed again. And the magistrate? Suspended pending investigation of the 11 prior cases. His voice was even, but there was something in it. Not satisfaction exactly. Closer to the quiet that follows a long tension finally released. The consortium's financing records have been submitted to the Capital Council. 3 pack lords will be called to answer formally. That proceeding will take months, but it will happen. And Davin. A pause. He withdrew the contest this afternoon, an hour after the reversal was recorded. Something moved through Evander's expression, brief and hard. He withdrew it, and filed a letter of relinquishment of all claims against the Vielle widow and her son, permanently recorded. June stood in the doorway and looked at him, and felt the ground under her feet in a way she hadn't in 2 years, solid and specific and entirely real. "Who is the Vielle widow?" Kian called from the table without looking up from his map. "You," June said. "I'm not a widow. I'm a cartographer. You're 7. Cartographers start young." She heard Evander exhale, not quite a laugh, the sound just before one, contained but present. And she looked at him, and found him looking at her with an expression that was open in a way she hadn't seen from him. The control still there, but something behind it no longer held quite so carefully back. She stepped aside from the door. "Come in," she said. She made tea this time, proper tea. The good dried leaves she kept in the tin on the high shelf, not the chamomile she used when she needed her hands occupied. She made it deliberately, measuring with care, and brought the cups to the table, and sat down, and Cian glanced up at Evander with the assessing gray eyes that missed nothing, and then looked back at his map. "Your territory is to the north," Cian said, to the map, rather than to Evander. "The Greywood." "Yes," Evander said. "Is it big?" "Very." Cian appeared to add this to whatever internal cartography he was developing. "Do you have wolves?" "Many." "Real ones or—" Cian glanced up briefly. "The other kind." Evander looked at June. She looked back at him. "Both," Evander said. Cian nodded with the air of someone whose suspicions have been confirmed and returned to his chalk. June wrapped her hands around her cup and let the warmth work into her knuckles and said nothing for a moment. Then, "I need to tell you something." Evander waited. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the bond." She kept her eyes on her cup. "I've been thinking about the difference between feeling something and choosing something. My mother used to say that instinct tells you what's true, and sense tells you what's wise, and the best moments in a life are when those two things agree." She paused. "I don't make decisions the way I used to. I make them slower, with more checking. I need you to know that about me." "I know that about you," he said quietly. "I'm not the same as I was before Rowan, before Cian, before 4 years of—" She stopped. "I'm not an easy thing to choose. June." His voice was low and direct, and it landed on her name like a hand on a still surface. No ripple, no pressure, just contact. "I have been choosing kingdoms since I was 19. I know what I'm choosing." She looked at him. He looked back. Cian, without lifting his head from his map, said, "If you're going to say something important, you should probably just say it." June closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you, Cian." "I'm just saying." She opened her eyes. The fire was warm. The tea was good. Outside the window, the frost was softening slightly. Not gone, not spring, but the particular quality of cold that has reached its limit for the day. "I'm choosing this," she said. Slowly, on my own terms. "And if at any point, then we stop," he said, immediately and without argument. "And Cian is your son. His comfort comes before everything else." Cian looked up at that, not dramatically. Just a glance, quick and evaluating, and then back to the map. But she saw the quality of it, the thing it landed on inside him. She knew her son. She knew what it meant to him when adults told the truth, instead of the version of the truth that was convenient. She reached across the table and put her hand over Evander's. Just that. Her hand over his, on the table. The warmth of the cup still in her palm. He turned his hand and held hers, carefully, like something that mattered. The hearing came and went. Davin Vielle did not appear. His relinquishment was read into the record by the circuit magistrate's temporary replacement, a dry, efficient woman from the capital who processed the Vielle matter in 11 minutes and moved on without ceremony. June sat in the hall in her good wool dress and her gray cloak and listened to the formal language undo in 11 minutes what had kept her awake for weeks, and felt the thing she'd been braced against simply not happen. Kian's provision was confirmed. The estate holdings in the Eastern Valley were registered formally in her name. The Vale family filed no further claims that year, or the year after. Sable submitted the corroborating testimony from the Farron family and Old Weiss's daughter, and the capital investigation into the 11 prior cases ran for 7 months and resulted in 3 land restorations and 2 criminal proceedings, which June followed from Veldmore, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had refused to go away. The 3 pack lords implicated in the consortium's financing were brought before the Lichen King's Council that winter. 2 submitted. 1 did not, and the resolution of that situation June learned about secondhand, in the careful language Evander used when he wanted to inform her without alarming her, and she appreciated the care while also making clear that she preferred to be told things directly. And he adjusted. He was good at adjusting. He was in Veldmore more than he was not, through that winter and into the spring. He did not move into the cottage. That was not a conversation they had yet, and she did not rush it. But he was present in the way she had not expected anyone to be present again, fixed, reliable, unglamorous in its consistency. He fixed the garden gate in February without being asked. He spent an entire afternoon in March, listening to Kian explain the complete geography of the fictional territory, asking questions that Kian answered with growing seriousness. The 2 of them bent over the chalk map, while June sat by the fire and did her mending, and felt something she recognized only slowly as ordinary happiness. Not the distant, managed version she had been practicing. The real kind. The inconvenient, unguarded, entirely vulnerable kind. In the spring, Tian named his fictional territory Evandermoor. He announced this at breakfast without preamble, sliding the chalk map across the table toward Evander, who looked at it for a long moment. "It needs a northern coastline," Evander said. "I know," Kian said. "I'm working on it." June looked at them both, the boy with the chalk and the king with the map. And the thing she had been holding carefully for months, at a distance, with both hands on the door, finally settled. She let it settle. On a morning in late spring, with the frost entirely gone, and the lane muddy with genuine warmth and the market smelling of fresh bread and green things growing, Evander stood with her at the stone bridge and told her what he wanted. Not in terms of territory or legal strategy or pack politics, just what he wanted. Quietly, in the voice he used when there was no performance required. She listened, and then she told him what she wanted. All of it. The cottage, Kian's education, her own name on her own things, a partnership that did not require her to diminish, a love that did not arrive pre-assembled from someone else's plan for her life. He listened. He said yes to all of it. She believed him, not because she was certain, but because she had learned the difference between a man who says yes to end a conversation and a man who says yes because he has actually heard you. She had been paying attention for months. She knew which one he was. "Kian will have opinions," she said. "Kian has opinions about everything," Evander said. "I've been taking notes." She laughed, a real one, unguarded and warm and slightly surprised at itself, the kind of laugh that happens before you decide to have it. He looked at her when she laughed the way he had looked at her from the end of the market lane 8 months ago, certain and quiet and entirely without apology. This time she let herself look back. They were formally bonded at midsummer, in a ceremony without excess. Just the ritual words, the lunar mark, the witnesses, and Tian standing in his best clothes with his arms crossed and his gray eyes very serious, taking the role of witness with the gravity of a head of state. Afterward, he told Evander that he expected the northern coastline of Evandermoor to be completed by autumn. Evander said he would see what he could do. June stood between them in the long evening light with the mark warm on her skin and the gray wood visible on the horizon, and her name, her own name, unchanged, added beside his in the record as she had asked, settled into the world like something that had always been true. She had come to the market that autumn morning, 4 years a widow, carrying grief like a second body, holding her son's hand and telling herself they were fine. They were more than fine now. They were whole. And the man who had watched her from the end of the lane, the king her 7-year-old son had warned away without knowing what he was, stood beside her in the summer dusk and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. Cian, walking ahead of them toward the cottage with his chalk already in hand, called back without turning. "Don't walk so slow." June took Evander's hand. They walked faster.